Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is about 11. It's 11:07. It's a Thursday morning. Hope everyone's doing good. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I talked about in my previous show or shows. I've been it. We always have our things that we go back to. I try to always have an open mind and like to think that's a quality that I have. That's pretty good. But there's always that thing. I think where we're with our tastes and stuff as individuals or even collectively, we always have our things that we kind of go back to, things that are you know well, to a degree, like comfort food, things that make you feel all warm and fuzzy, but no, but things that you just you naturally want to go back to, something that fits, like a when you put on a good pair of jeans or a good pair of shoes, it just feels comfortable. So film wise, I've been diving back in deep to the world of horror exploitation and just exploitation. I don't know, I can't get enough of it. It's my favorite style of films. I'm gonna try to go up. It's been about a month since I've gone. So I did a few posts recently on the last few movies that I bought. I had a bunch of stuff I was kind of inundated with as far as movies go. Well, and I do not want to portray that as a problem because it's not. But I sometimes get inundated with movies that I want to watch just in my my regular time, and then movies that I want to watch, but then also watch them and then do a show on them. I usually like to watch when I do a show for this channel. I usually try to do it right after, usually typically the morning after I've seen the movie. I usually try to do it that way because of, the freshness of just having that experience. So that's usually what I do. Lately, what I've been doing, which is going to be today's show, I've been doing a lot more music oriented shows, which is really, a total blast. I really enjoy it. It's, just all part, it, you know, it's a branch that's part of the same tree for me. I did a show on Miles Davis Quintet, which is my favorite jazz group of all time. Of course, my favorite band of all time, and also electronic, in the world of electronic music. Autechre did a show on them. Also did another show on Suicide, which is again one of the most important, if not the most important, band in the world of electronic music. I love them to death. Can never get enough of them. I also did a show on the Chemical Brothers, another huge influence on me, a band that really kind of helped and shaped and warped my brain, to where it is right now. Um, and then I'm trying to think. I know I did some other music shows. I did one actually on Pink Floyd live at Pompeii. I believe I did a show on that one, which is my favorite period of Pink Floyd. It's for me the best thing that they ever put out. I also did a show on Jimi Hendrix, a concert, a band of gypsies live at the Fillmore East, which is my favorite period of Hendrix. So all of these bands that and groups that I've done shows on, I might be leaving something out, probably am, but all of these shows are, and as obviously with all the movies, these are all groups that have a tremendous experience for me. It's always a tremendous experience for me. I not only do I listen to these groups constantly to some capacity, especially I probably out of those groups that I've mentioned, I probably listen to out of those groups, I'd say Autechre and the Miles Davis Quintet. Those are the two groups I probably listen to just about on a daily basis to some capacity, or at least during the week sometime. It's just like it's always constant inspiration, or just constant, constant feed of that wonderful music and art. But these, all of these groups, for what it's worth, all are a massive, massive, if not the biggest influence or influences on my band Quantum. You know, so again, for my writing process, my weird little project band that I have, this is the stuff. These are the ingredients that make it what it is. And there's a slew of other groups. There's a slew of other influences. Obviously, movies are the biggest, but music wise, at face value, this is that's the group of bands that I always that I'm always influenced by. And then today's show is on another group that is also a really favorite, is a favorite group of mine. And it's, also elements of what these guys do and this particular style, or this guy, I should say, what they do has always been a part of what I do with Quantum. And that is this Canadian band. It's really one guy, and they are called Wapstan, and they are from Montreal, Canada. And it's labeled. I mean, labels are labels, but it's pure noise music, if you want to call it something. Wapstan comprises of Martin Sasseville, and he is based out of Montreal, Canada. I got into his music, and again, the thing that's so interesting, I never really, up until probably 13 years ago or so, when I started to kind of, explore some of this music, I had a circle of friends that lived in the area, and they've all like kind of moved away. Some of the folks still kind of carry on the tradition where they have these house parties, but I kind of went into a different social circle. And but when I was with that group, I got exposed to a lot of very experimental and very strange music, a lot of noise music, or if you want to call it noise, but very fringe music. And it was interesting because a lot of the music, like anything, it was a massive kind of exposure period to lots of music. And I, it's a for what it is, it's a massive genre. So there's good things in that genre. There's bad things. But it was funny because I never thought of just the label of noise music as a thing. Like noise, isn't it noise music? Isn't it like a weird oxymoron? Is that like really a thing? But I never thought of that before. After seeing lots of artists that were kind of in that style, and then it became this thing of where, oh, I guess it is. It was really strange and funny and eye opening and interesting. And before I kind of like got pulled into that whole kind of scene, I'd always been into music that has a fringe element, where there's a lot of dissonance and, a lot of distortion. So always been kind of open to that kind of music. And so, but when I got exposed to the noise kind of scene, if you want to call it that, it was uh, it was a weird experience. I wasn't sure what to think of it, but I have an open mind, and I was like, this stuff is very unique. It's very different. It's very harsh. It's very intense, and I don't know if I can listen to this on a regular basis, but it piques my interest enough to where I want to check it out. And a lot of the noise stuff, well, if you go back quite a few years, last year I finished up a really awesome autobiography on Sun Ra. And Sun Ra was like a jazz quartet group, orchestra, if you want to call it that, was, from the group itself that Sun Ra put together. He was a composer, piano player, very, very much an avant-garde artist. He came out into, well, prominence in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even into the 80s. Very experimental music, very modern jazz, but also elements of atonal, where there isn't necessarily melody per se, lots of free music, lots of free jazz or interpretation of melodies, and also very harsh elements of where it was also psychedelic, but then where there wasn't really any melody per se, but yet it just created this kind of vibe. And and it's a really fascinating read about Sun Ra. They talked a lot about their time in England, his time in England and in New York, and when there was this very experimental music scene going on in New York at the time with lots of new keyboards that had just, with the new technology of electronics coming out and all of this real experimentation happening during this period of where you had, you know, all of these artists coming out of this kind of bohemian kind of scene of where there was all it was all about experimentation, and Sun Ra was a product of that. And so the origins of noise, if you want to call it that, actually goes back quite a few decades. And it was very interesting reading this biography because I didn't really think it was a thing like, or I didn't think of it in terms of like an historical in a historical context, if that makes any sense. A lot of the titles or ways that some of the music that came out of this movement, a lot of the times it's labeled as modernism, electronic futurism, or the Dada movement. This style, like again, kind of more or less started in the 50s and 60s. Very interesting, and it always morphed into other things. Like the Fluxus movement was another movement in the 60s. And there was all of these, experimentations going on during those decades. And so when I heard, and I will say it actually, I think yeah, it still exists, but there's a shop in Portland, Maine called Strange Maine. So during this period that I was getting exposed to a lot of this, this noise music, and usually what the performances would consist of is you would have one or two solo artists. They would have some kind of loop pedal or loop station where they would have something where they could loop these sounds. They would have these little tiny mics that were called contact mics, and they would basically have the mics placed on, say, like a metal slab or a piece of plastic or connected to some kind of instrument, and they would basically create these strange ambient kind of loops, and they would continually build these these kinds of sounds to where sometimes it would be pure kind of ambience, kind of almost relaxing to a degree. There might be like a hint of melody or there might be a melodic element, and in other parts of it could be very, very harsh and very guttural, and really for all intents and purposes there would not be any real cohesive like melody going on, but it was just the impact of it, and it was very guttural and very kind of confrontational, but it kind of created this orb of sound, or this bubble of sound that was, I don't know, kind of unique and oddly meditative. And during that time when I was getting exposed to a lot of the music, I came to a lot of this music. I became aware of this place down in Portland, Maine, which is about 2 hours away, and it still exists. And it's called Strange Maine. And the people, at least at the time, and I think still now, were all artists that were doing music like this, a lot of experimental music. And they were also doing shows inside the store itself. And they had, commercial, it was a record shop, movie shop, book shop. They sold tons of movies on VHS. And but they also their big thing that they did, or the kind of that they specialized, was like really weird kind of underground music. So a lot of noise artists, a lot of weird, fringe kind of uh, you know uh, punk music, things like part of the Dada movement, like it was one of the names I mentioned, like groups like Throbbing Gristle, things like that. So a lot of experimental, a lot of fringe kinds of things, and that was kind of their focus. And I used to go there, and I would buy all of these singles. I would buy these like CD singles or albums, just totally on a whim, without knowing who any of these artists were. But I don't know. I started to really have an interest in this kind of strange music, so I started buying quite a few of these albums. And one of the bands or groups I bought a few albums by this group called Wapstan, which is today's show. And he is an artist, a Canadian artist based in Montreal. He actually he's still very active. He has lots of different albums. He put out an album 1 or 2 years ago that is radically different than the stuff that I have, but it's still pretty interesting. It's a little bit more kind of easy to digest. It's not quite as harsh, and it has a little bit more melodic, has a little bit more of a melodic kind of sensibility to it. But it's still, very much kind of in the noise vein. But the earlier albums that I bought of his, I remember the first album that I bought of his, I didn't know what to think of it. It was like this, I don't know, like a weird cacophony of hate. It was so strange. But then I got addicted to it, and there was this one. I had bought 2 or 3 albums by Wapstan, and I listened to them, and there was this one album which I believe was his first or second album. And again, when I bought it, which was like 10 or 12 years ago, this album was a few years before that. He's actually been around for quite a few years, but this one album that I had, again, it was like I didn't know what to think of it. But then I found myself kind of oddly into it, and I started listening to it more and more, and then it became this like obsession. And it's an album I still listen to this day. And it was really interesting because it reminded me of, and again, this is going back to kind of the movie connection or analogy. It really put me in this mind. Like anybody out there, I've done a series of shows on them. But if anybody out there has not seen, or most people have seen, the original Evil Dead by Sam Raimi, uh, you know, horror masterpiece. One of the best low budget movies ever made. And so there's a sequence in the movie where the Necronomicon, which is the magical book, the occult book that is, you know, used in the book to summon these demons. There are these scenes that after there is this invocation, and it takes place in this cabin where there is this disembodied demon or spirit that is like traveling through the woods. And the way the film is shot, and when you're introduced to this whole thing of this like disembodied spirit, it's traveling at this incredibly rapid rate through the woods. Like it's cutting through the trees, cutting through the water. It's some of the most incredible, I think, camera work ever done. But it's very intense, and it's beautiful, but it's terrifying. It's nightmarish, but it's very intense, very harsh. And it's interesting, when I first got into Wapstan, it made me think of that cinematography in Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, the first one. It made me think automatically, wow, this music could be used for that scene. And it always put me in that state of mind, which is kind of funny and odd. But even to this day, it makes me think of the woods and these disembodied or demons, you know, dwelling within this habitat. It's very interesting. And Wapstan's music, again, it's interesting because it really, you know, totes a line, because there isn't necessarily, well, there really isn't any melody. And we're, you know, obviously, you know, I think in music, being a fan of music, or being a composer of music, or being a writer of music, you know, I think, and over the years I've kind of arrived to this conclusion, but I kind of feel like, you know, melody is key. You know, once you have a melody established, whether you're like in the audience or you're the composer or the writer or the performer, like once there's a melody introduced, that's usually where you have um, the people or person's attention. Usually that's the kind of the hook that, if you have a good melody, that is, I feel, is like kind of the starting point. And if you have that established, you can take that person on a really interesting journey. And often thought, and I've kind of come to this conclusion, but often if there isn't that kernel of goodness, if that isn't part of your presentation, whether you're in the audience or you're on stage performing in front of people, then you never really get that hook. You never really get those people excited or inspired. Whether you're writing the music or you're listening to the music. But again, so like the whole noise thing, and again, there's a lot of artists in the style of noise. There's another group I really really love, which I will probably eventually do a show on. A group called Pharmacon, which is a single woman who she's based from New York. She's amazing. There's a whole slew of really interesting kind of noise artists out there. And so Suicide, like again, I mentioned how I did a show on them. They have a very big component of that in their music, also. But there's actually a lot of really great noise artists out there. There's another group out there that I can think of called Rat King, which is pretty interesting. I really love Pharmacon a lot, but my favorite is Wapstan. And again, the style of this music is so interesting because, I think art should entertain, should take you on a journey, take you out of the mundane experience. But I also feel music should also, to a degree, rattle your cage a little bit, push you a little bit, make you, like it's like from that, you're waking up in the morning and you're having that cup of coffee, or where you're starting your day, but you need a little bit of a kick, you need a little bit of a jolt. And I feel like, art to a degree should, whether it's music, film, dance, whatever it is, anything in the performing arts, I feel like to a degree, music should have, and art should have that kind of element where it's going to like shake you up and pull you around and make you bend you or shape you in some way. But basically, kind of shake the cage a little bit. Because I feel like when that happens, to that in that capacity, at least from my perspective, that's when you feel alive. That's when you feel like, oh, I'm awake, I'm alive, I'm breathing, I'm exhaling, I'm kind of, maybe I'm a human being, and it just, really reminds you of certain things. But it basically wakes you up and it makes you feel alive. At least it does for me. But the interesting thing with the whole kind of noise thing, like some of these groups I'm talking about in this style, is it does away to a degree everything I just said about the concept of, say, melody in music. It kind of takes that concept and to a degree like flushes it down the toilet, and it like presents to you instead this, box of chaos that you need to maybe, or not, but go through it and find maybe things in it that are interesting or not, that are, not conceived by, any kind of conventional rule. So it's very interesting. So again, like I said, good art, to a degree, and it's always in the eye of the beholder. Um, but it should rattle your cage, and I think that this music, and again, to some degree, you can't call it music. But what it does, like for me, it does rattle my cage a little bit, but it also has this oddly comforting thing to me, and it really, and again, it doesn't have any traditional musical things to it. For all intents and purposes, it literally is noise. But I think it's with the, particularly around the elements of where the drone elements or the monotonous aspect of it, where you can take sound and pure sound, but be able to alternate alternate it, manipulate it to some degree, I think there can be this thing of where you can like create a certain kind of meditative state. And I feel like that's what this does. Like it doesn't have any conventional melody, it doesn't have chords or structure or vocals or a hook or a big fat groove or a beat. It's really about just kind of creating this, I don't know, oddly strange or electrifying in the moment reaction to this aesthetic. So, and again, it's a fringe style of music. Wapstan is very fringe. And at one time, I was like, I can only listen to this kind of stuff in a very particular, kind of state of mind. But I find myself, I can actually kind of listen to it really any time. It is therapeutic. I think it's very much, I think, part of the electronica world too, because there are natural sounds that are used, but there's also lots of keyboards and distortion, manipulation of audio, so it has very much an electronic vibe to it. So to me, it's just another part of the genre, but very interesting stuff. And I highly recommend anybody out there that thinks they have a pretty good open mind and is open to other forms of art that are in style that is not really part of any kind of conventional mindset. I definitely say check out some of this stuff, particularly Wapstan or Pharmacon. It's very, very interesting, and it's a journey. It's not because of the nature of the way it's presented. It's obviously not for everyone, but I really deeply appreciate some of this music. And Wapstan, I'd say, out of the time that I've spent kind of diving into this style of music for the last big chunk of time, I kind of feel like they're my favorite group, and I have a few of their albums. It's always an interesting trip when I listen to their music. So yeah, check them out, and have a great day. Peace.